Okay, hello everyone, and thanks to Gresham College for inviting me to give this talk. So this is going to be a talk on cryptocurrencies. So in particular, that means I'm going to be talking about Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is presently the best known cryptocurrency. By the end of the talk, though, my aim is going to be much more general than that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what cryptocurrencies are, what some of the present limitations are, how those limitations might be overcome, and more generally, how the future of cryptocurrencies might play out. So Bitcoin's been with us for a number of years now. It was launched in 2009 and started being reported on in the mainstream media soon after that. Right from the start, though, it's been somewhat controversial, right? So for many people, when they first hear about cryptocurrencies, the immediate reaction is that this is just some sort of elaborate Ponzi scheme. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are many people for whom Bitcoin is the beginning of a decentralization revolution. Right, which is about much more than just currency, which more generally is about the flow of information and who controls the information. Okay, so the idea there is that Bitcoin is first presented as a currency, right, as a decentralized currency, but that it provides decentralization methods which are much more applicable, much more generally applicable than that. Okay, so which could be applied to scenarios such as the World Wide Web, for example. Right, so in the context of the World Wide Web, the idea might be that you want to apply these technologies in order to avoid a situation where you have a small number of very powerful companies controlling the flow of information in ways that might not be entirely transparent. Okay, wherever you lie on that spectrum then, right, whether you think that cryptocurrencies have significant potential applications or not, one thing we can all agree on is that cryptocurrencies presently have some very serious problems if they're to overcome if they're going to be useful on a large scale. Okay, so for example, it's been a major problem for Bitcoin that it's been extremely volatile. That's been reported on repeatedly in the press. Another serious issue for Bitcoin, which is often referred to as the scalability problem, is the fact that Bitcoin can only process a small number of transactions a second. Okay, so Visa can process something of the order of 50,000 transactions a second when required. Bitcoin can process something in order of 7 transactions a second. Okay, so that's 50,000 transactions a second for Visa, 7 transactions a second for Bitcoin. So this is a serious issue, right? If you want to see cryptocurrencies being viable on a large scale, taken seriously as large scale currencies, then you're going to want to see improvements in transaction rates of several orders of magnitude. If you're more ambitious than that and you want to see these technologies being applied to create a decentralized Web 3.0, in that case you're going to need to be able to process many millions or billions of transactions a second. Okay, so those are a couple of issues, and there are other issues as well. So what I want to do towards the end of this talk is to talk through what some of the most serious issues for cryptocurrencies are presently, and then we'll talk about what some of the solutions might be as well. Okay. Before we get there, though, I want to take a step back. Okay, I want to talk, sort of go through some of the basics. I want to talk about what cryptocurrencies are, how does Bitcoin work. Okay, and then once we've got through some of those basics, then we'll come to discuss the future of cryptocurrencies more generally. Okay, so now let's go to my slides. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is to explain precisely how Bitcoin works. In order to do that, though, we do need a couple of very basic ideas from cryptography, first of all. Okay, so I promise this is not going to be a technical talk. In order to describe how the Bitcoin protocol works, we do need just a couple of really basic ideas from cryptography. So first of all, I want to quickly go through those. The first basic idea we need from cryptography is hash functions. Okay, so hash functions are very simple things, at least in terms of the service they provide, which is all we need to know about them right now. So they're functions, which means they take inputs and they give outputs. And the form of input that a hash function takes is just any piece of data. Okay, so you can think of data here as being represented by binary strings, so just sequences of ones and zeros. Okay, so what a hash function does is it takes any binary string as input, and it gives a binary string of a fixed length as output. So normally we work with hash functions which give outputs which are 256 bits long. Okay, so a hash function just takes any binary string as input and gives you a 256-bit string as output. Okay, and then it has one other crucial property, right? So it's a function, which means whenever you give the same input, it has to give you the same output, right? But other than that, hash functions act essentially like random string generators. Okay, so the basic idea there is that if I feed the same input to this function a number of times, and each time I'll get the same output. Okay, but if I go back and I change the input even a little bit, maybe I change a single 1 to a 0 or something like that, then this function will act essentially like a random string generator and will very probably produce something entirely different. Okay. So in particular, one thing this means is you're unlikely ever to find two different inputs or ever hash to the same value, right, if you have a good hash function. And why is that? Well, that's just because of the number of possible outputs here. Okay, so the number of possible outputs here is 2 to the 256. That's more than the number of atoms in the universe. So that means if I give two different inputs to this hash function, okay, and if this thing is acting essentially like a random string generator, then the probability it maps these two strings to exactly the same output, this is astronomically small. Okay, so you can just basically think of different inputs as always corresponding to different outputs. Okay, so that's our first basic tool for cryptography. Hash functions, they're very simple things, basically they're just random string generators, which always produce outputs of the same length. Then the second basic tool we need from cryptography is digital signatures. Okay, and again, the functionality provided by digital signatures is extremely simple. Okay, so the underlying cryptography might be clever, but we can black box all of that. All we care about right now is the way in which they're used, which is as follows. Okay, so let's suppose that one person wants to send a message to another, and let's suppose the person who wants to send the message is Alice here, that she wants to send the message to Bob. Okay, so again, the message is just a piece of data, so you can think of it as being a binary string. So in that context, cryptography provides us with a clever process Alice can go through, whereby she takes her message and she uses this clever process to produce a special extra piece of data, right? Which I'm picturing as this little box of data off to the right of the message here, right? So this extra piece of data is specific to the message, right? Which we call that extra piece of data the signature for the message, Alice's signature for the message. And the way in which this works is that she then sends the message together with the signature to Bob. Then, through the magic of cryptography, Bob can be sure that the message came from Alice. Okay, so if Alice wants to send a message to Bob, she goes through this special process which produces this extra special piece of data, which we call her signature for the message, right? And she sends the message together with the signature to Bob, and Bob can thereby be sure that the message came from Alice. Now, it's clear that if this is going to work, then of course the signature has to be specific to the message, right? Because if not, right, different messages have different signatures, then, if different messages have the same signature, then Eve, who's listening in here, she'd be able to take a different message, right? And she'd be able to take her Alice's signature for the first message, append it to her second message, and make it look like this second message is from Alice. Okay, so we don't want that. It's also clear that, of course, Bob has to be able to efficiently verify that Alice's signature is correct, right? When he receives a message together with Alice's signature, he has to be able to verify that this is indeed Alice's signature for that message. But it can't be the case that Bob can produce the signature in the first place. Otherwise, he's going to be able to produce messages and produce signatures for those messages and make it look like those messages are from Alice. Okay, so I should say here that I'm picturing the signature as this little box of a few symbols to the right of the message here. It looked like it's only a few symbols long. In reality, the signature would be a few hundred bits long. Okay. Okay, so overall, it might be slightly surprising that this could be done, but it can be done. And what's important for our purposes now is just that the functionality achieved, right? And the functionality achieved is very simple. So when someone sends a message, the receiver can be sure who the message came from. So those are our two basic tools, right? So we have hash functions, which are just random string generators. Then we have digital signatures, and the functionality they provide is very simple. So they ensure that people can be sure who messages come from. Okay. So now we have those two basic tools. Let's think about how we might design our own cryptocurrency. Okay, so the whole point of Bitcoin is that we want it to be decentralized. So ultimately, we want to define a currency, a protocol, which works without the use of a central bank, without any centralized point of control. Okay, and the motivation there is that centralized control, or too much centralized control, can be a bad thing, right? So those in control can be corrupted or otherwise compromised, and decentralized systems can be more robust. Okay, so ultimately, we want to define a protocol which works without the use of a central bank. Okay, just to keep things simple to start with, though, I'm going to start by imagining how we might design a digital currency which works with the use of a central bank. Okay, so we'll start off with the use of a central bank, and then we'll think about how to remove the use of a central bank later on. It's presumably also the case that our currency is going to be divided up into multiple units of currency, right? So the equivalent of many pounds or many dollars. Again, just to keep things simple though, let's start off by concentrating on what happens to a single unit of currency, a coin, let's say. Right? And let's imagine that coin is indivisible. So in that situation, we might run things as follows. So we might insist that every user of the currency keeps a ledger for this coin. Okay, and that ledger might look something like I've depicted here. So this is a version of the ledger that records the fact that the coin is presently owned by Alice. Okay. It also records the fact that the coin was originally owned by John. Right? That John was the first owner of the coin. Let's not immediately worry about how John came to own the coin in the first place, because that's a slightly separate issue. So if Alice now wants to spend her coin, what she could do is to form a new version of the ledger recording the fact that the coin is now owned by Frank. Okay, so let's suppose that she wants to spend the coin. She wants to give the coin to Frank in return for some chickens, let's say. Okay. So what she then does is she forms this new version of the ledger, right, recording the fact that the coin now belongs to Frank. And she sends this new version of the ledger to the central bank. The central bank then distributes the new version of the ledger to other users. Okay. In order that only Alice can spend her coin, though, we don't want other people to be able to spend Alice's coin, right? In order that only Alice can spend her coin, we better require that her digital signature is added to this new version of the ledger. Okay. So that way only she can spend the coin, because only she can add the necessary digital signature. So I'm pitching the signature here. This is this little black box on the end of this new version of the ledger, right? So this is Alice's signature for the new version of the ledger, giving the coin to Frank. Okay, and of course, if Alice had to add her signature onto this new version of the ledger, giving the coin to Frank, well, then John would also have had to add his signature earlier on when he formed the new version of the ledger, giving the coin to Alice. Okay. So when Alice wants to spend her coin, she forms a new version of the ledger, a new signed version of the ledger, giving the coin to Frank. She then forwards this new signed version of the ledger to the central bank. They then check that everything's in order, that the signature is correct, and so on. And then the central bank can forward this new version of the ledger to all users. When Frank sees that new version of the ledger has been distributed by the central bank, he's then happy to give Alice her chickens. Okay. So what have we achieved with this simple process? Well, first of all, it's clear that only Alice can spend her coin here, right? Because only Alice can add the necessary digital signature to the new version of the ledger. Okay, so only Alice can spend her coin. It's also clear that she can't spend the coin twice, because if she forms one version of the ledger giving the coin to Frank, right, and she forwards that to the central bank, and then later she forms a new version of the ledger giving the coin to somebody else, Derek, let's say, and she forwards that new version to the central bank as well, well, then the central bank will see that this is a second contradictory version of the ledger, and the central bank would object. Okay, so only Alice can spend her coin, and she can't spend the coin twice. So this gives us a rudimentary functioning currency. Okay, so all of that was with the use of a central bank. Now let's have a little think about what happens without the use of a central bank. Okay, so let's run things in a fairly similar way. And let's suppose that when Alice wants to spend her coin, she now forms a new version of the ledger, giving the coin to Frank, as before. She signs that new version of the ledger. Now, though, she can't give that new version of the ledger to the central bank, right, because there is no central bank. So what she does is she starts distributing the new version of the ledger directly to other users of the currency. Those other users of the currency have to check that the transaction is correct, that everything's in order, that the signature is correct, and so on. Once they've done that, they will then pass the new version of the ledger on to other users of the currency who proceed in the same way, and so on. Okay, so what now goes wrong? Well, it's still the case in this situation that only Alice can spend her coin, right? Because only Alice can add the necessary signature, right? So only Alice can spend her coin still. The problem now is that she might be able to spend the coin twice, right? So what Alice could now do is to form one version of the ledger giving the coin to Frank, right? And another version of the ledger giving the coin to Derek. The question is, how are we to know which version of the ledger is correct? Okay, and there are all sorts of tricks you might try to get around the issue here. So for example, you might stipulate that users should believe the version they see first. Right, then what Alice could do is to form one version of the ledger giving the coin to Frank, show some people that version first, then form another version of the ledger giving the coin to Derek, show others that version first. Or you might decide, right, well, if Alice is signing these contradictory versions of the ledger, then clearly she's dodgy in some way. So what we should do is just invalidate both of these transactions, and maybe we'll also cancel Alice's coin to punish her. Okay, the problem then is that Alice might first form a new version of the ledger giving the coin to Frank. Right, at this point, Alice has done nothing wrong. Right, so Frank is then happy to give her the chickens. Then, once she's got these chickens from Frank, right, Alice can then form a contradictory version of the ledger, giving the coin to someone else. Right. According to our new rule, then this would then cancel the transaction, giving the coin to Frank, meaning that Alice is able to take Frank's coin away. Okay, so that doesn't work either. And in fact, there really is no extremely simple fix. So what can we do here to avoid double spending? Well, let's take it in stages. First of all, we were working according to the assumption before, right, that we were considering a single coin. Right? That was just for the sake of simplicity, so let's now drop that assumption. So let's now have a universal ledger which works essentially the same as before, except that now it records what happens to all coins. Okay, so now all users of the currency keep a universal ledger which records what happens to all coins. So that version of the ledger might look something like in the figure I've drawn here. Okay, I should say at this point that initially I'm setting things up here slightly differently than Bitcoin. Okay, so we're going to start a little bit different, and then we'll make it like Bitcoin later on. Okay, so so far so good. We're just gonna now keep a universal ledger which records what happens to all coins. Okay, let's also imagine that the way that this ledger works is that each transaction here specifies its predecessor in some way. Okay, so the third transaction here, if you like, will specify somewhere within its data that the second transaction here is its predecessor. Okay, so what that means is that if I'm given a valid version of the ledger, then I can't form another valid version of the ledger by, say, just removing the second transaction and having the third transaction point to the first, right? Okay, so we're going to run a universal ledger which records what happens to all coins. Okay, and we're going to run this ledger in such a way that it's fairly tamper-proof, right? So people can't just take the ledger and change the order of transactions and get it to produce another valid ledger. Okay, so now what we could do in order to avoid double spending is to specify what we'll call a proof of work for each transaction. Okay, so the proof of work for a transaction is just the outcome of some hard computational task which is specific to that transaction. Okay, so that's some task which would take the average computer a long time to carry out. Okay, then we agree that when you can only append a transaction to the ledger once the corresponding proof of work for the given transaction has been completed. Okay, so that initially sounds a little bit mysterious. Don't worry, I will specify later on exactly how the proof of work for each transaction should be defined. Okay. So we specify that this proof of work has to be completed before each transaction can be added to the ledger. Okay, so now what happens is that when Alice wants to spend her coin, she sends the transaction out into the network of users as a whole, and everybody then starts working to try and find the corresponding proof of work. Okay, once somebody finds the proof of work for the transaction, then the transaction can be added to the ledger. And the way I'm depicting this here is that once someone finds the corresponding proof of work, then the transaction turns red. Okay, so red transactions could be added to the ledger. Okay, so far so simple. We just specify a proof of work for each transaction that has to be found before the transaction can be added to the ledger. So far, though, it might not seem that we've achieved that much. Right? All we really seem to have done is to ensure that it's harder to add transactions to the ledger. Okay, now though, we just need to make two further specifications, and we'll have established a protocol that suffices to avoid double spending. Okay. So here are the two further specifications. So first of all, we specify that the correct version of the ledger is always the longest one. Okay. So that's the one with the most proof of work attached. Right, so if any user sees two different versions of the ledger, then the one they'll regard as correct is the longest one. That's the first stipulation. And the second stipulation here is that we specify the transaction is considered confirmed once it's in the correct version of the ledger, once it's in the ledger with the appropriate proof of work, and once it's followed by sufficiently many transactions. Okay, so what sufficiently many means here will depend on the level of security you want. So more security means be followed by more transactions. So for the sake of being concrete, you might imagine that let's say a transaction is going to be confirmed once it's in the ledger with the appropriate proof of work, and it's followed by 6 transactions in the ledger, let's say. Okay. Okay, so those are two very simple specifications. We specify that the correct version of the ledger is the longest one, and a transaction is confirmed right once it's in the ledger and it's followed by sufficiently many transactions. So why would that work though? Why would those specifications suffice to avoid double spending? Well, let's imagine that I'm Frank, and that Alice is transferring her coin to me in return for these chickens. Right? Let's suppose that the longest version of the ledger at the moment looks like I've depicted here. Okay, and let's suppose that the transaction I care about is the third one there, the one that I've circled there. Okay. Well, now if Alice wants to double spend, then she's going to have to form a new version of the ledger, right, which doesn't include the transaction I care about. In order for anybody to believe that new version, though, right, it's going to have to be the longest version of the ledger. So what Alice is going to have to do is she's going to have to fork off before the transaction that I care about, right? And she's going to have to start trying to form a new, longer version of the ledger, which branches off in this new direction. Okay. For each transaction she adds in, though, she has to find the corresponding proof of work. Right? She can't use transactions appearing after the ones that I care about, right? Because we've got this tamper-proof ledger in which the order of the transactions matters, right? So if I try taking this transaction here and then posting it over here, that won't work because this transaction specifies within its data which is its predecessor. Okay, so that won't be a valid version of the ledger. Okay, so for each transaction she adds in, she really has to find the corresponding new proof of work. She can't use the transactions appearing after the ones I care about because they specify their predecessors. So the problem for Alice, though, as she tries to do this, is that while she's trying to form this new, longer version of the ledger, the rest of the network combined is working to extend the longest chain. Yes. Okay. So ultimately, in order for Alice to catch up and produce the longest chain, right, she's going to have to be producing proofs of work faster than the rest of the network combined. Right, in order for her to double spend, she's going to need more computational power then, right, than the rest of the network combined. So that's the guarantee. So the idea is that a malicious user won't be able to double spend here unless they have more computational power than the rest of the network combined. As long as that's not the case, then what we've established is a secure and tamper-proof ledger which operates in an entirely decentralized way. Okay, so that's basically how Bitcoin works. There are some further details to tie up here, though. Okay, so first of all, let's call the people looking for the necessary proof of work miners. Okay, so the first issue we have is that producing all these proofs of work is going to be expensive, right? In fact, it better be expensive, otherwise the malicious users are going to be able to afford to do too much of it. Okay, so producing all these proofs of work is expensive because there are substantial hardware, electricity, and other costs involved. Obviously, miners won't do their job for free, right? So we better pay them for their effort. How can we do that? Well, it's at this point that it's convenient that we're defining a currency. Okay, so what we can do is we can simply give miners some units of currency whenever they find appropriate proof of work. Okay, so that's what Bitcoin mining is, and that's why people Bitcoin mine. Then that was the first detail. So a second detail to be tied up is so far I've considered a version of the ledger in which we append individual transactions. Actually, it turns out that if we work that way, we'll end up with all sorts of timing issues. Okay, so the basic problem is that the underlying communication network has some latency, by which we mean that it takes time for messages to travel across the network. Transactions are normally produced at a rate which is high compared to network latency. So as a result of the latency, users will tend to see transactions arriving in different orders. Okay, so different users will see the transactions arriving in different orders. Okay, and this will mean that honest users get split between several competing longest chains, different versions of the ledger. And that ends up harming the security of the protocol. Okay, so it turns out to work much better if we have miners group transactions together into large blocks of transactions, as I depicted here. So each of these guys now is supposed to be a block of transactions. Okay, and each block of transactions might actually have a few thousand transactions in it. Okay, and then rather than requiring a proof of work for each individual transaction, now we just require a proof of work for each block, right? So that's the way Bitcoin works, and the difficulty for the proof of work in Bitcoin is adjusted so that on average we have one new block produced once every 10 minutes. Okay, and then so there's a couple of details tied up there, and then one further detail. So I said earlier on I'd specify precisely how each proof of work should be defined. So actually it's quite easy to do this. We can do this using any agreed on hash function. Okay, so to specify the proof of work required for a block of transactions now, right now we require one proof of work per block. What we do is we take the data for the block, and then we agree that the required proof of work, right, is what we'll call a nonce for the block. Okay, so a nonce is a very simple thing. It's just a binary string that we can append to the block data, so that the extended sequence, okay, the block together with the nonce, hashes to a string which ends in k many zeros, let's say. So here k is a variable which is chosen so as to tailor the difficulty of finding the nonce. So if k is 1, right, that means we've got to find something which hashes to something that ends in a single zero. Right, that means that on average we're going to have to try 2 different nonces before we find one that works. If k is 2, then on average we'll have to try 4 different nonces. Right? So things are growing in powers of 2 here. In the general case, the average number of tries is 2 to the kth power. Right? So if we make k large, then finding a nonce for the block becomes a hard computational task. By playing with different values of a k, we can make the task of finding a nonce, i.e. the task of finding the relevant proof of work, precisely as easy as hard or hard as we want it to be. Okay, so that's basically how Bitcoin works. Of course, Bitcoin has in some ways been a massive success. It presently has a market capitalization of over $200 billion. It's important to understand what are the limitations of Bitcoin are, though, and there are many limitations. So what I want to do next is just to have a little think about what some of those limitations are. I'll discuss some of the limitations. There isn't time to discuss all of the various issues that Bitcoin has. So a first basic, a very serious issue here is the fact that Bitcoin is extremely energy intensive. Okay, so recent estimates show Bitcoin mining consuming more electricity than the entire nation of Switzerland. So in the present climate situation, of course, that's something that should be taken very seriously and is something to be avoided if at all possible. That's one issue. Another thing you can complain about with Bitcoin, or think about as a potential issue, is the issue of security. So in the argument we went through there, it was suggested that Bitcoin should be secure so long as no malicious user has more computational power than the rest of the network combined. Right? So initially that sounds like it's pretty safe, it's pretty secure. Things become a little bit more nuanced though when you perform a more careful analysis. Right? If you start thinking in terms of an adversary who wants to perform an attack which is not just designed to double spend. Think of it when we think in terms of an adversary who wants to repeatedly double spend, so as to cheat and earn money, but so as to bring this currency down, right? In that sort of context, when we consider that sort of attack, it becomes important to ask, okay, so not just how much computational power does the adversary need in order to carry out this attack, but what percentage of the total market capitalization will it cost them to buy that much computational power? Okay, so it might be that they require more computational power than the rest of the network, but how much would that be? How much would it cost them to buy that computational power? Right, the answer is around about, say, 1% of total market capitalization, or maybe that's a problematic situation. Right? If a malicious user can spend something like 1% of the total market capitalization in order to buy enough computational power to destroy the currency, well, then that's potentially problematic. And in fact, there are very good reasons why a figure of that sort of order of magnitude has to be true for proof of work protocols of this sort. Okay. So with Bitcoin, so far this has never happened. So why would someone spend huge amount of billions of dollars trying to bring down Bitcoin? Perhaps the situation changes, but if this becomes a vital part of your infrastructure, you might have higher security requirements. Okay, so that's something that's a potential issue that's worth thinking in detail about anyway. And then a third very serious issue is one that I mentioned earlier on. So this is the issue of transaction rate. So Visa can presently process something in the order of 50,000 transactions a second, while Bitcoin can process 7 transactions a second. So obviously this is something which has to be dealt with. Okay, so those are a few of the limitations. Now let's have a look at what some of the possible solutions are. The first two of the limitations that we listed there, a solution that's already very well understood, is to replace proof of work with something that's called proof of stake, okay, which is probably best explained by comparing how it works with proof of work. Okay, so a proof of work protocol, like Bitcoin, as we've already described, right, so there certain users are selected and are allowed to update state by appending new blocks to the ledger. Right? For each user, the probability that they get to append the next block, i.e. the probability that they get to find the next proof of work, is proportional to their computational power, right, with a proof of work protocol like Bitcoin. And a proof of stake protocol is somewhat similar. Okay, we select users to update state. So for example, we select users to produce new blocks. Again, the same sort of way, but now the way they're selected is with probability proportional to how much currency they own. Okay, so now it's how much currency they own rather than how much computational power they have that matters. So proof of stake protocols bring with them their own set of problems, their own complexities, but they're now quite well understood. And they solve the energy issue and are potentially also much more secure than proof of work protocols. Okay, so for the first couple of those issues, proof of stake protocols are a very sort of promising possibility there. For the third issue of transaction rates, we need to understand the problem a little better before we can talk about solutions. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is to understand why is it that Bitcoin has such low transaction rates in the first place. Well, it turns out that there are two bottlenecks here. Okay, so two bottlenecks and then solutions in 3 layers. Don't worry about the solutions quite yet. We'll come to consider those in a moment. Okay, so we have two basic bottlenecks. Roughly speaking, the first bottleneck stems from what we call network latency, right, by which we mean that it takes time for information to travel across the underlying communication network. So if Bitcoin blocks are produced too fast, then this network latency causes confusion and causes the protocol to become less secure. We'll see why, we'll see the details of that in a little bit. So very roughly, that's the first bottleneck. Then the second bottleneck stems from the very basic fact that if all nodes of the network are required to verify and record all transactions, well then you can only go as fast as your slowest node in the network. Okay. So now let's just briefly consider each of those bottlenecks in a little bit more detail. So as I said, the first scaling bottleneck is caused by the fact that it takes time for information to travel across the underlying communication network. Okay, so when a Bitcoin miner appends a new block to the ledger, it takes time for that new block to propagate through the network. Okay. When 2 blocks are found almost simultaneously, this means that some nodes in the network are going to see one block first, right? And other nodes in the network are going to see the other block first. So this causes different versions of the longest chain and splits the honest nodes of the network. Okay. So now some honest miners will be working to extend one chain, right? While other miners, honest miners, are working to extend the other, and this makes it easier for a malicious user to double spend. Now with Bitcoin, these splits are happening quite infrequently, but if you double the rate at which blocks are produced, then they'll happen twice as much. Okay, double the rate at which blocks are produced, you get twice as many forks of this sort. Okay, if we go as far as producing a block every 5 seconds or so, then what we're going to see is forks within forks within forks within forks, and chaos is going to ensue. Okay, so this is the first scaling bottleneck. Basically, network latency means blocks can't be produced too fast without sacrificing security. Okay, that's the first scaling bottleneck. And then the second scaling bottleneck is perhaps more basic, more fundamental. The basic point here is that so long as all users have to verify all transactions, then of course this very much limits the rate at which they can be processed, right? You can only go as slow as as fast as the slowest node in the network. How significant this limitation is depends probably upon the level of your ambition. Okay, so if you only want to process a few thousand transactions a second, then it might suffice to overcome the first scaling bottleneck. Okay, if you're more ambitious than that, if you want to create this decentralized web 3.0, well, okay, in the decentralized web 3.0, we can't possibly have users verifying the actions of all users, right? So in that sort of application, one's going to have to deal with the second scaling bottleneck as well. Okay, so those are the two fundamental bottlenecks So now let's have a little think about, have a little look at what some of the various forms of solution are. Okay, and then the solutions to the scalability problem can be thought of as existing in three distinct layers. Okay, so roughly then, so layer 0 solutions involve improvements to the underlying infrastructure used by the protocol. So if internet speeds are improved, for example, well then it'll increase transaction rates. Okay, so layer 0 solutions are generally going to be fairly basic, and they're going to help overcome the first scaling bottleneck. Okay, so that's layer 0 solutions. Then layer 1 solutions are those which involve changes to the underlying protocol itself. Okay, so these might be aimed at overcoming either the first or the second scaling bottleneck. So since Bitcoin was launched in 2009, so many alternative protocols have been suggested and developed, and many of those protocols do have much higher transaction rates than Bitcoin. Okay, so there certainly are more efficient protocols out there now. There's a difficulty here in terms of the herding effect, right? So it's not going to be advantageous for anybody to switch over to those new protocols unless a fair number of other people are doing so at the same time. Okay, so the question is, how do you get people en masse to move over to a new protocol? Okay. Sharding is another interesting layer 1 solution which involves running multiple blockchains simultaneously. Okay, that's a possible form of layer 1 solution. And then layer 2 solutions, these are perhaps the most potent form of solutions. So these are solutions which, if you like, sit on top of the underlying cryptocurrency. So the idea there is you take an underlying cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, right, and then without necessarily making any changes to the cryptocurrency itself, you build an auxiliary protocol that sits on top of that, and which makes use of the underlying cryptocurrency blockchain. Okay, so the basic idea is, with all of these layer 2 protocols, the basic idea is that most interactions between users should be able to take place off-chain, if you like, okay, and within this auxiliary protocol, so long as those off-chain interactions produce enough evidence for disputes to be resolved on-chain if necessary. So a famous example of a layer 2 solution is the Lightning Network, which has been built to operate on top of Bitcoin, okay, which allows for very high transaction rates. Okay, so to finish off with, let's just very briefly talk about what the future holds for cryptocurrencies, what the future might hold. A basic point to make here is that making predictions is made especially hard by the human element to all of this. Okay, so the human element makes things hard, but we can talk with some authority about what should be technologically possible. Okay, if we lay down concretely what the technology should allow for, then I guess how things will pan out in actuality depends on the human element as well. Okay, so one of the big questions here is just how much appetite there is in the mainstream for decentralized technologies. So as we've discussed, one of the main limiting factors for Bitcoin has been this question of transaction rates. Can very high transaction rates be achieved? And the answer is absolutely yes, they can be. Okay. The way in which this plays out, though, will depend on the human element. Right. So if users stay loyal to Bitcoin, right, if Bitcoin remains the #1 cryptocurrency, well, in that case, truly fundamental changes to the underlying protocol are difficult. So in that case, you're really relying on layer 2 solutions, right? The kind that we were just discussing, right? So these are solutions which sort of sit on top of the underlying cryptocurrency and don't require changes to the underlying cryptocurrency. Okay, so in that sort of situation, right, if Bitcoin remains king, then we're really relying on layer 2 solutions such as the Lightning Network to facilitate higher transaction rates. If, on the other hand, some combination of layer 1 and layer 2 solutions is possible, right? In other words, so if we can replace Bitcoin with a more efficient protocol and build layer 2 solutions on top of that, well, then this allows for a much stronger solution in terms of transaction rates. Then what role will cryptocurrencies play in the future, given higher transaction rates? I guess there's many proponents of Bitcoin talk excitedly about how Bitcoin is going to replace fiat currencies such as the pound and the dollar. I think the truth is, at least in the short term, that isn't at all likely, and if it did happen, it would be quite a scary thing. Right? So with currencies such as the pound, governments and central banks have all sorts of ways of responding to changing economic environments. Right? So they can do things like applying quantitative easing or changing interest rates. And in that way, they can stimulate the economy when deemed necessary and rein things in at other times. Such mechanisms for control are presumably necessary, okay, and presuming they're necessary, it's not really clear what exactly would be the replacement in a fully decentralized economy. Okay, how would the replacements for those mechanisms work? Okay, so it's probably unlikely, at least in the short term, that we're going to see Bitcoin replacing fiat currencies. If there is a strong appetite for decentralized applications, though, then what I think we'll see, is cryptocurrencies taking a role that exists alongside existing fiat currencies. Okay, so these are protocols which provide methods of decentralization that can be applied to contexts outside currencies, or contexts such as the World Wide Web and financial markets. Okay, so when everyone looks to apply these decentralization techniques, there are always going to be efficiency trade-offs, okay, at least in the sense that decentralized solutions will normally be computationally less efficient. So that means, at least in the short term, if we're going to see the mainstream adoption of cryptocurrencies, then one might expect it to be in applications such as the financial markets, where computational efficiency is important, but where market efficiencies are key. Okay, so I'll finish there. I hope you enjoyed the talk. At this point, it just remains for me to say thanks for listening.